When my son dropped those coins into my hand and told me I would never know luxury, something inside me died and was reborn at the same time. It wasn't the coldness of the metal touching my skin that hurt me, it was his gaze, that look of pure contempt, as if I were less than nothing, as if my entire existence were a disgrace to him. He stood there in the entrance of that mansion I'd helped build, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my 3-month rent, handing me his bus ticket like someone giving alms to a beggar on the street corner. But the worst of all, what truly shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces, wasn't even that specific humiliation. The worst was looking at that arrogant man, with his $15,000 watch on his wrist, his gleaming Italian shoes, his hair perfectly cut at an expensive salon, and realizing I no longer recognized him. This was the same baby I rocked through endless nights when he had colic, crying desperately as I sang softly to calm him. The same 7-year-old boy who ran into my arms crying when school bullies ripped his backpack and threw his books into the mud. The same teenager who hugged me tightly at his father's funeral, whispering that we would be okay, that we would get through it together. How had that boy become this man who looked at me with such contempt? Months later, as I parked that $32 million Rolls-Royce in front of his house, I saw coffee dripping down his Italian silk shirt, the cup falling to the ground in slow motion, his eyes wide with utter shock. For the first time since he was 5, my son Daniel was completely speechless. But to reach that moment of sweet revenge, to see that look of utter disbelief on his face, I had to go through a journey that nearly destroyed me completely. A transformation so profound that sometimes I don't even recognize the woman looking back at me in the mirror. And today, here and now, I'll share every painful detail, every moment of doubt, every tear shed, every difficult decision that brought me to this point. If you've made it this far, you probably know that family relationships aren't always the fairy tales we imagine when we're young and naive, right? Here on this channel, you'll find a safe space where real stories like mine are shared without judgment, without filters, without the falsehood we see everywhere. These stories will deeply move you, make you reflect on your own experiences, and perhaps even give you the strength to make the necessary changes in your life. Subscribe to the channel now and be part of this incredible community where every story matters, where every pain is validated, and where you'll always be welcome exactly as you are. Now join me as I tell you all the details of how my life was completely turned upside down, and how I transformed from a poor, despised nurse into the most powerful woman I could ever imagine. My name is Margaret, and for 52 long years, I lived what everyone calls a normal life. I married very young, just 19, to a man named Thomas who worked as a mechanic in a small shop outside Atlanta. We met at a church party, one of those innocent parties where everyone brought home-cooked food and stayed up late chatting in the parking lot. He was quiet, hardworking, and honest like few others. He wasn't rich, far from it, but he had the dignity of a man who earns his living by the sweat of his brow. We were married in a simple ceremony, with only 20 guests, in a small chapel my mother frequented. My wedding dress was borrowed from my friend's cousin, the shoes I bought on sale for $23, and the cake was made by my aunt, who owned a small bakery. We began our life together in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, with second-hand furniture we found at garage sales and newspaper ads. But we were happy, or at least I thought we were. Thomas worked Monday through Saturday, came home with his hands covered in grease, showered, and ate dinner in silence, watching the news. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was present, he was constant, he was my safe haven in that world. Our son Daniel was born when I was 23, after nearly 4 years of trying to get pregnant. Those were painful years of failed attempts, of medical tests we couldn't afford, of hopes that were born and then died every month. When I finally saw those 2 lines on the pregnancy test, I cried so hard that Thomas was scared, thinking it was something bad. The birth was long and difficult, 32 hours of labor in a public hospital where the nurses barely had time to look at me properly. But when they placed that baby in my arms, when I looked into those small dark eyes staring back at me, I knew I would give my life for him without a second thought. Daniel was a difficult baby. He cried a lot, with terrible colic that made him scream for hours. I spent entire nights pacing around the small apartment with him in my arms, singing the same songs over and over, begging him to stop crying for just 5 minutes so I could breathe. Thomas worked so much that when he got home all he wanted was to sleep, so caring for the baby was almost entirely my responsibility. When Daniel was just 6 months old, I got a job as a nursing assistant at the Atlanta Public Hospital. We desperately needed the extra money. Thomas's salary barely covered the rent and basic bills. I left Daniel with an elderly neighbor who cared for 3 children in her apartment for $50 a week. Every morning I woke at 4:30, prepared the day's bottles, took the still sleeping Daniel to Mrs. Ruth's house, and rushed to catch 2 buses that took me to the hospital. I worked from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then caught the same 2 buses back, picked up Daniel, returned home, and began my second shift caring for him, cleaning the house, and cooking dinner. Thomas arrived at 7, ate dinner, watched television, and was asleep by 9. Our life was a mind-numbing routine of work, fatigue, and never-ending bills. When Daniel turned 2, I finally passed the exam to become a registered nurse. I had studied for a full year, borrowing books from the library, studying after Daniel slept, taking practice tests until my eyes burned with fatigue. The day I received the news that I had passed was one of the happiest of my life up to that point. It meant a substantial raise in salary, better benefits, and a chance to finally breathe a little. I started working the morning shift at the same hospital, now making $12 an hour instead of the 8 I had been making as an aide. It seemed like a fortune at the time. We were able to move into a 2-bedroom apartment. I bought new furniture for Daniel's room, and enrolled him in a better daycare. Things were finally looking up. Daniel grew up a normal child, neither particularly bright nor particularly troubled. He got average grades in school, had a few friends, and enjoyed playing video games and basketball. I went to every school meeting, every game, every performance. Thomas rarely made it because he worked Saturdays, so I was the mom who was always there, always cheering, always supporting. I saved every penny I could to buy Daniel designer sneakers because he begged, saying the boys at school laughed at his cheap sneakers. I myself wore the same 3 patched nurses' uniforms, the same holy shoes, but my son had to have the best I could give him. That was always my philosophy, even if it meant having nothing for myself. When Daniel was 17, our world fell apart in a way I never could have predicted. Thomas had a massive heart attack while under a car at the shop. He died before the ambulance even arrived. I got the call at the hospital where I worked, an ordinary Tuesday in April that started like any other and ended with my life shattered. I rushed to the shop, but by the time I arrived, he had already been taken away. I went to the hospital where I worked, ironically, and saw my husband of 22 years covered in a white sheet on a stretcher in the emergency room. Daniel was at school when it happened. I had to pull him out of math class to break the news. I saw something shatter in my son's eyes that day, an innocence that never returned. He didn't cry at the time, just stared at me silently, processing, trying to understand how his father, who had left the house that morning complaining about the traffic as usual, simply no longer existed. The funeral was modest because we didn't have adequate life insurance. Thomas always thought he was too young to worry about such things, always saying he'd take care of it later. We had to crowdfund a basic funeral with friends and family. Daniel stayed by my side throughout the ceremony, holding my hand tightly, never shedding a tear. I was worried about him, about how he was processing the loss, but I myself was so broken I could barely function. The following weeks were a blur of grief and practical necessity. I had bills to pay, a teenage son to raise, a house to maintain. There was no time for proper mourning, no time to process the loss. I had to keep working, keep functioning, keep being strong. It was around this time that Daniel began to change. Before, he was sweet to me, affectionate, and hugged me easily. After Thomas's death, he became distant and withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his room, went out with friends I didn't know, and started getting worse grades at school. I tried to talk to him countless times, but he always said everything was fine, that he just needed space. I respected this, thinking it was his way of coping with grief. But looking back now, I realized that it was around this time that I began to lose my son. He began to see our life, our financial situation, our simple home, through different eyes. He began to be ashamed of where we lived, of not having the things his wealthier friends had, of relying on a nurse's salary. When it came time to consider college, Daniel made it clear he wanted to go to the University of Georgia, one of the best in the state. I had saved $8,000 over the years for his education, but it was far from enough. Tuition was $23,000, not including room and board, books, and everything else. I did the math repeatedly, lying in bed at night, trying to find a way to make it work. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I took on an additional part-time job giving injections and changing bandages at a nursing home on Sundays. I was constantly exhausted, my body ached, and I barely had time to eat properly, but I managed to scrape together another $15,000 during Daniel's senior year of high school. When he received his acceptance letter from the university, his joy was so pure, so genuine, that all the overtime, all the exhaustion, everything was worth it in that moment. He hugged me for the first time in months, told me I was the best mother in the world, that I would make it all worth it. I took out a $20,000 student loan in my name to cover the rest of his freshman year. The plan was for him to get scholarships and work part-time for the following years. I helped him move into his dorm in August, an old but charming building on campus. I cried the whole way home, a mixture of pride, sadness, and exhaustion. My baby was growing up, going out into the world, and I was being left behind. The first few months were difficult. Daniel would call occasionally, always needing something. Extra money for books I hadn't anticipated, money for a group project, money for lab supplies. I sent what I could, even if it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner for weeks. When he came home for the holidays, I noticed he was different. He spoke differently, used words I didn't recognize, told stories about people and places I couldn't imagine. He brought dirty clothes for me to wash and spent most of his time in his room or hanging out with friends from school. During the rare meals we ate together, he would look around our small apartment with what seemed like discomfort, almost shame. During Daniel's 4 years of college, I worked non-stop. I took every available extra shift, every holiday shift no one wanted. I worked Christmas, New Year's, Easter, and Thanksgiving. I had to pay off his student loans and still send him regular money. Every semester brought new expenses, always something he desperately needed. I saved $43,000 over those 4 years just for his education, not counting the loan. Every cent came from extra shifts, from working holidays, from personal sacrifices. I was 43 when he graduated, and I felt like I was 60. My body was wrecked from overwork, I had chronic back pain, my hands shook from fatigue, and I had developed high blood pressure from stress. But when I saw Daniel walk across that stage and receive his diploma, when I saw my 22-year-old son in that cap and gown, all the suffering seemed worth it. I took picture after picture, cried with pride, and hugged him tightly. He hugged me back but quickly pulled away because his friends were waiting. I spent the graduation ceremony alone in the stands while Daniel celebrated with friends whose parents I saw in groups, laughing, taking professional photos, and making reservations at expensive restaurants for a celebratory dinner. I walked alone back to my cheap hotel on the outskirts of town, ate a vending machine sandwich, and slept in my nurse's uniform because I had a shift the next morning. Daniel landed a job just 2 weeks after graduation. An investment firm in Atlanta offered him $60,000 a year plus bonuses. He was ecstatic when he called me with the news, speaking so fast I could barely keep up. He was finally going to start his real life, he said. He was finally going to get what he deserved. That phrase stuck with me. What he deserved. As if everything we had before wasn't enough, wasn't worthy. I helped him move into a small but modern apartment near the office. I bought him dishes, pots, towels, everything he needed to get started. I spent $2,000 I didn't have, putting it on a credit card, but I wanted my son to have a decent start. During the first few months of his new job, Daniel still visited me occasionally. He'd come for Sunday lunch, eat the home-cooked food I'd prepared with such care, and bring packed lunches for the week. He'd talk about work, his colleagues, and opportunities for advancement. I listened attentively, even though I didn't understand half the financial jargon he used. I was so proud to see my son thriving, growing, and becoming a successful man. I never imagined those visits would soon become increasingly rare until they practically disappeared. It was in the fall of that year that Daniel called me saying he'd met someone special. Her name was Rebecca, and she worked at the same company, in the marketing department. He spoke of her with an excitement I hadn't seen in years, describing her blonde hair, her blue eyes, her laugh, her intelligence. I was happy for him, imagining that I would finally have a family, that maybe I would have grandchildren to spoil. I asked to meet her several times, but Daniel always had an excuse. They were very busy, their schedules didn't coincide, maybe later. I began to realize he was deliberately putting it off, but I didn't understand why. When I finally met Rebecca, I understood immediately. It was over dinner at a fancy Italian restaurant in downtown Atlanta, a place I never would have gone to on my own because the prices were outrageous. Daniel insisted on taking me there to meet his girlfriend, saying it was important to him. I bought a new dress at a department store, the prettiest one I could find in the clearance section. It cost $93, and I broke out in a cold sweat as I swiped my card. I got my hair done at the cheap salon near my house, spending another $20. I wanted to make a good impression. I wanted to make my son proud. Rebecca arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes late, as if on purpose, as if she wanted to make an entrance. She was intimidatingly beautiful, perfectly made up, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my rent, a designer bag I recognized from magazines, and sky-high heels that made an elegant click on the wooden floor. When Daniel introduced me, Rebecca extended her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her handshake was weak, almost dismissive. She assessed me from head to toe in seconds, and I saw everything she thought of me in that look. Poor. Classless. Inadequate. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing in my defense. Dinner was a tortured 2 hours. Rebecca talked the entire time about places she'd traveled to, expensive restaurants she'd frequented, social events she'd attended. She casually mentioned that her father was a vice president of a major tech company, that she grew up in a mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhood, and that she attended an expensive private university. Every word was a subtle nudge, a reminder that I didn't belong in that world. Daniel seemed bewitched by her, nodding along with everything she said, laughing at her jokes that I didn't find funny. When the bill arrived and I saw it was $247, I nearly had a fit. Daniel paid with his corporate credit card, explaining that he could claim it as a business expense since they were discussing company strategy. I felt immense relief because I wouldn't have been able to pay my share. Over the next few months, Daniel's visits almost completely ceased. He was too busy with Rebecca, with her social life, with events, dinners, and parties in her circle. When I called, he'd answer in a hurry, always saying he was in the middle of something important and would call me later. He rarely called. He'd occasionally send short messages, asking how I was, but he didn't even expect a proper response. I felt increasingly invisible, as if my role in his life had ended now that he no longer needed me for anything. I continued working my shifts at the hospital, returning home to an empty, silent apartment, eating alone, sleeping alone, living alone. The loneliness was physical, aching in my chest, taking the air from my lungs. The proposal came a year later. Daniel called me on a Saturday afternoon, sounding excited. He'd proposed to Rebecca in Paris during a business trip she'd managed to turn into a romantic getaway. She said yes. They were getting married the following summer. I should have been happy, I should have been thrilled, but all I felt was a deep sadness. I knew that marriage would take me even further away from my son. I wasn't wrong. Wedding preparations began immediately, and it was clear from the start that I would have no say in them. Rebecca and her mother, a cool, elegant woman named Patricia, made all the decisions. The venue would be Atlanta's most exclusive golf club, the guest list 300 people, mostly friends of Rebecca's parents and important business contacts. The theme would be white and gold, classic elegance, no tacky sentimentality, according to Rebecca. The initial budget was $80,000. $80,000 for a wedding. I worked a full year and didn't earn that. Rebecca's parents would pay $60,000. They expected the groom's side to contribute at least $20,000 to avoid a bad look. Daniel came to visit me 2 weeks later to discuss it, the first time he'd been home in months. He sat at my old kitchen table, the same piece of furniture we'd had for 20 years, and explained the situation. He said he understood it was a lot of money, that he knew I had no savings, but that it was really important to make a good impression. Rebecca's parents knew very influential people. This marriage would open doors for his career. It was an investment in their future. Every word was like a knife. An investment. As if my son's marriage were a business transaction. I asked how much he expected me to contribute. He hesitated, then said $20,000 would be ideal, but $15,000 would be acceptable. $15,000. I had $12,300 in savings after years of working non-stop, after paying for his college education, after all the sacrifices. That $12,000 was my security, my emergency fund, all I had in the world. I stayed up all night after he left. I looked at my online bank account. At that $12,000 it had taken me years to save. I thought about saying no, explaining that I simply couldn't contribute that much. But then I imagined Daniel having to tell Rebecca's parents that his mother couldn't help. I imagined the shame on his face, and I couldn't bring myself to do it to him. The next day I went to the bank and took out a personal loan for $8,000. With interest at 14% per year. At 54, I went into debt again to fulfill another of my son's dreams. I gave him $15,000 in a check, telling him it was all I had saved but that I wanted him to be happy. He hugged me quickly, thanked me, and left 10 minutes later, checking his phone, already thinking about something else. The wedding was in June, on a blisteringly hot Saturday. The club was stunning, decorated in white and gold just as Rebecca wanted, with expensive flowers everywhere, waiters in tuxedos serving expensive champagne to the guests who began arriving at 4 in the afternoon. I arrived early because I had nothing else to do, didn't know anyone, and had no specific role other than being the groom's mother. I wore the dress I'd bought for that dinner months ago, the same one from the sale, because I couldn't afford another after giving $15,000 to the wedding. My shoes were old and uncomfortable, but they were the only ones I had that were remotely appropriate. I sat in a corner of the enormous ballroom, watching the wealthy guests arrive in their designer clothes and glittering jewelry, chatting about European trips and investments and business deals. The ceremony was beautiful in a cold, impersonal way. Rebecca looked stunning in a wedding dress that cost $20,000 alone, according to what I heard. Daniel looked handsome in his rented tuxedo, nervous but happy. When they exchanged vows, I cried. I cried not only with emotion but with a deep sadness I couldn't fully explain. I felt like I was losing my son forever, that he was entering a world where I had no place. Patricia, Rebecca's mother, was in the front row on the bride's side, weeping gently into a lace handkerchief. I was in the third row on the groom's side, alone, crying into a paper napkin I had in my purse. The reception was even worse. I was seated at a table in the back of the room with Daniel's distant cousins I barely knew and childhood friends he hadn't seen in years. Patricia insisted on sitting at the head table, of course, along with Rebecca's father and a few VIP guests. I was supposed to be there too, as the groom's mother, but apparently Patricia convinced Rebecca that it would be better to have more important executives at the head table. Daniel didn't question it. I spent the entire party sitting at that table, politely chatting with strangers, watching my son dance with his new wife, cutting the ridiculously expensive cake, and giving interviews to the professional photographer. When it came time to take family photos, Rebecca organized everything. Photos with her parents, photos with her grandparents, photos with her aunts and uncles and cousins. When it was my turn, Rebecca told the photographer she just wanted a few quick shots, nothing too elaborate. They took 3 photos of me with Daniel and Rebecca, all of us smiling forcibly, and that was it. It was over. Patricia had a 20-minute photo shoot. I had 2 minutes. I left at 10 o'clock before the party ended, because I couldn't take it anymore. No one noticed I was leaving. Daniel was busy greeting important guests, Rebecca was dancing with her father, everyone was drinking and laughing and celebrating. I took an Uber because there were no more buses at that hour, spent $23 I barely had, and went back to my small, empty apartment. I took off that dress I hated, took off the shoes that had blistered my feet, and cried myself to sleep. On Monday, I was back at the hospital, working my 6 to 2 shift, as if nothing had happened. The following months were deafeningly silent. Daniel didn't call during their 2-week honeymoon in Bora Bora. He didn't call when they returned. I sent several messages asking how they were, how the trip was, if they needed anything. I received short, generic responses. Everything was great. Wonderful trip. You don't need anything. Thank you. I tried to schedule lunch to catch up on their lives, but Daniel always had an excuse. Too much work. Rebecca is busy decorating the house. Maybe next month. Next month never came. In September, 5 months after the wedding, I received a message from Daniel saying he needed to talk to me in person about something important. My heart raced. Maybe Rebecca was pregnant. Maybe they wanted to break the news to me in person. I cleaned the entire apartment and prepared a special dinner with roast chicken and mashed potatoes, things Daniel had loved as a child. I waited anxiously. They arrived promptly at 7, which was strange in itself. Daniel was never punctual. Rebecca was impeccable as always, wearing a designer outfit and perfect makeup. Daniel was wearing an expensive suit. They didn't touch the food I'd prepared. They said they'd already eaten. This hurt more than it should have. We sat in the small living room, and Daniel got straight to the point. They had found their dream home in Buckhead. A $3 million mansion with 6 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a pool, and an elaborate garden. It was the perfect opportunity, a home where they could raise a family, entertain important people, and establish their social standing. They were already approved for financing, but they needed a down payment of $200,000. Rebecca's parents were putting up $150,000 as a wedding gift. They expected me to contribute $50,000 for the same reason. $50,000. I was speechless. Daniel continued talking, explaining how important it was, how this house would define their future, how they couldn't miss this opportunity. Rebecca sat in silence, checking her phone, clearly bored by the whole conversation. I tried to explain as delicately as possible that I didn't have $50,000, that I was still paying off the loan I'd taken out for their wedding, that my salary was $42,000 a year. Rebecca let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes visibly. Daniel looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't just disappointment. It was shame. Ashamed of myself, of my poverty, of my inability to contribute at the level they expected. He said verbatim, "I didn't expect much, Mom. I know you can't afford it." But Rebecca's parents insisted I at least ask. The word affordances came out of his mouth laced with contempt, as if my financial situation were a moral failing, a choice I'd made to disappoint him. Rebecca stood up abruptly, saying they had to go, that she had dinner with friends at 8:30. Daniel followed her obediently. They were out in less than 15 minutes. I looked at the set table, at the food I had prepared with such care, which they hadn't even touched, and something inside me cracked. I didn't cry then. I was beyond tears. I just sat there in silence, processing what had just happened, processing how my son had become this person I no longer recognized. The following weeks were the darkest of my life. I kept working because that's what I did, that's who I was, but I was just going through the motions. I ate because I needed to, I slept because my body demanded it, but I was just existing, not living. Christmas was approaching, and I prepared to spend it alone, already assuming I wouldn't be invited to whatever celebration Daniel and Rebecca were throwing. I was right. I found out through a former neighbor who worked as an events waitress that they had an elaborate Christmas party on December 23rd. They rented space at a private club, invited 60 people, had champagne and oysters, and a 5-course menu prepared by a renowned chef. I wasn't invited. I spent Christmas alone in my apartment, eating a simple frozen meal, watching old movies, trying not to think about my son celebrating without me less than 10 kilometers away. New Year's arrived without a message from him. My birthday in January passed without acknowledgement. In February, 3 months after that awkward conversation about the house, Daniel called me again. His voice was different, irritated, impatient from the start. He said Rebecca was pregnant. I should have been happy, but his tone didn't allow me to feel that way. He went on to explain that they needed to decorate the baby's room, buy designer furniture, hire a famous decorator. All of the best quality because that's what Rebecca deserved. Patricia had already promised $15,000 to help. He wanted to know if I could lend him the same amount. Lend him. As if he'd ever returned a single cent I'd spent on him throughout his entire life. I explained that I didn't have $15,000, that I was still paying off my wedding loan, that my finances were tight. He laughed. A bitter, cruel laugh. He said I'd always been poor, always would be poor, that it was sad he'd been born into a family with no ambition, no drive, no desire to achieve anything better. Those words fell from his mouth easily, as if he'd thought them over and over again. He said he'd managed to escape that life, that he'd worked hard to build something better, but that it was embarrassing to have to explain to Rebecca and her parents why her mother couldn't contribute financially like a normal family. I hung up the phone while he was still talking. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone. I spent that entire night in a kind of trance. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't do anything. I just sat in the darkness of my apartment, listening to the silence, processing his words. Ambitionless. Poor. Embarrassing. Each word was a stab in the back. I, who worked 3 jobs simultaneously for years to pay for his education. I, who sold my only valuable jewelry, my mother's, to pay for his preparatory school in high school. I, who hadn't taken a single vacation in 15 years so I could save every penny for his future. Ambitionless. That was the darkest week I can remember. I seriously considered just giving up. Stopping working, stopping fighting, letting the world swallow me up. I had no one left, no purpose. My son hated me, despised me, was ashamed of me. But then, on an ordinary Thursday in February, while I was on my shift at the hospital caring for an elderly patient dying of cancer, something shifted inside me. The patient, a 78-year-old woman named Dorothy, took me by the hand and said something I'll never forget. She said, "Do you know what my biggest regret is? It's not traveling more or working less. It's spending my entire life living to please other people who never thanked me. Don't make my mistake, my dear. Live for yourself. Build something that's yours." She died 2 weeks later, but those words stuck with me. That night, I got home from work and instead of simply falling into bed exhausted like I usually did, I sat at the kitchen table and started making a list. A list of everything I wanted to do, everything I wanted to be, everything I wanted to prove. At the top of the list, I wrote in bold letters, "Show Daniel he was wrong." I was 56 years old. Not young, but not old either. I had perhaps 20 or 30 productive years ahead of me if I took care of my health. I wasn't going to spend those years being invisible, being overlooked, being the poor, pathetic mother my son was ashamed of. I began obsessively researching ways to build wealth. I read books on investing, real estate, entrepreneurship, and the wealth mindset. I spent every free minute studying, taking notes, and creating plans. I cut all non-essential expenses from my life. I canceled my $67 a month cable service, started bringing lunch from home instead of buying food from the hospital cafeteria, and walked the 2 miles to work instead of taking the bus whenever the weather permitted. Every penny I saved went into a separate account I opened specifically for investments. After 6 months of intensive study, having accumulated $3,000 in savings, I did something everyone thought was crazy. I resigned from the hospital where I had worked for 30 years. I gave up the stability, the benefits, the retirement that was only 14 years away. My colleagues thought I had lost my mind. Some thought I was having a nervous breakdown and tried to convince me to take medical leave instead of quitting. But I knew what I was doing. I had a plan, and I needed more time and energy to execute it than a traditional job would allow. I used the $23,000 I received in severance pay and bought my first investment property. A small, old house in a developing neighborhood called Edgewood, near downtown Atlanta. The house cost $19,000 and was in terrible condition. Broken windows, faulty plumbing, peeling paint, and a yard overrun with weeds. But I saw potential. I saw location, I saw good bones, I saw opportunity. I spent the remaining $4,000 on basic building materials and did most of the renovation myself. I spent 3 months painting walls, fixing faucets, sanding floors, pulling weeds, and planting inexpensive flowers. My body ached in ways I hadn't known. I developed calluses on my hands. I burned in the sun until the skin peeled, but I kept working. While renovating the house during the day, I worked nights as a nurse in a pay-per-visit home care service. I saw 5 to 7 patients a night, earning $30 per visit. I worked from 7 in the evening until 3 in the morning, sleeping 4 hours, waking up, and returning to renovate the house. This routine lasted 3 months. I survived on coffee, determination, and a deep-seated rage that fueled me. Every hammer blow, every brushstroke was fueled by the memory of Daniel's words. You will never know luxury. You have always been poor. Without ambition. I finished the renovations in August and put the house up for rent for $1,200 a month. A young Mexican immigrant family, a couple with 2 young children, rented it immediately. They were hard-working, honest people who cared for the property as if it were their own. I began earning $1,200 a month while continuing to work as a home health nurse at night. After paying taxes and basic maintenance, I had $800 left over in net profit per month. Money I didn't have to actively work to earn. Passive income. The feeling was intoxicating. I reinvested every penny of that money, along with everything I earned from my night job. 6 months later, I had saved enough to buy a second property, another old house in need of renovation, this time in a neighborhood called Kirkwood. I repeated the process. I renovated everything I could myself, hiring help only for the parts that required specific permits, like electrical and complex plumbing. I rented them out for $1,100 a month. I now had 2 homes generating passive income of almost $1,600 a month after all expenses. During all this time, Daniel never called me once. Not even to check if I was alive, not even to ask how I was doing, nothing. I stopped trying to stay in touch. I blocked him on social media so I wouldn't see his elaborate posts about his perfect life. I focused all my energy on building my real estate investment empire. Every property I bought, every renovation I completed, every tenant I signed was a victory against the person my son said I was. By my 58th birthday, I owned 6 properties generating a combined monthly income of $6,800. I had transitioned from home nursing to a property management consulting position for a small firm that paid reasonably well and left me with free time to manage my properties. I began studying the stock market, cryptocurrencies, and alternative investments. I discovered I had a talent for spotting trends, for seeing opportunities where others saw too much risk. It was through the management company that I met Howard, a 65-year-old businessman who had built a considerable fortune in real estate investments over 4 decades. He was semi-retired, looking for someone to gradually take over his business because he had no interested heirs. We chatted casually for weeks at industry events and networking meetings. He was impressed by my story, my determination, and the portfolio I had built in just 2 years. When he offered me a partnership in his real estate consulting firm, I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. Howard proposed the following to me. I would take over the day-to-day operations of his company while he gradually stepped away. I didn't have the capital to buy outright, but we could structure a deal where I would buy out from him over 5 years using the company's own profits. It was risky, it was bold, but it was exactly the opportunity one needed. I accepted without hesitation. At 59, I became a partner in a real estate consulting firm that generated $3 million in annual revenue. The first few months were intense. Howard taught me everything he knew about complex investments, creative financing, and networking with serious investors. I worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, learning, applying, and growing. We expanded the company aggressively, closing larger deals and taking on more ambitious projects. By the end of the first year, revenue had grown to $4.5 million. By the end of the second year, it had grown to $6 million. Howard was delighted, saying he had found not just a successor but someone who would take the company further than he ever imagined. At 61, I bought out Howard's interest and assumed full control of the company. I also had my own personal portfolio of 12 rental properties generating $15,000 a month. My net worth had reached $2 million. I, the poor nurse with no ambition. In 5 years, I had built more wealth than my son would ever see in his lifetime working his corporate job. But it still wasn't enough. It wasn't about having enough money. It was about proving a point. It was Howard who connected me with international investors who were seeking local partners for a major development project in Atlanta. A consortium wanted to build 3 luxury residential towers on a prime site near downtown. They needed a local partner who knew the market, had connections with City Hall, and could manage ground operations. The minimum investment was $5 million. I had $2 million in assets, but most of it was tied up in real estate. I did something bold. I refinanced all 12 of my properties, extracting all the equity I could. I sold 3 of them for high prices because the market was hot. I took out commercial loans using the company as collateral. I scraped together every penny I could and invested exactly $6 million in the project. It was absolutely everything I had. If the project failed, I would be financially destroyed. But I trusted the research, I trusted the projections, I trusted my analysis. Besides, at that point, I had nothing left to lose. I had no family, no personal life, only the drive to prove Daniel wrong. The project took 2 years to complete. 2 years of constant anxiety, endless meetings, difficult decisions, and sleepless nights wondering if I'd made the right choice. The first units were released for sale when the first tower was completed. They sold out in 3 months, all 42 units. The second tower sold even faster. The third wasn't even officially launched. The units were sold through waiting lists. When everything was finalized and the profits distributed, my share was $28 million. $28 million. At 63, I had more money than I ever dreamed possible. I bought a $5 million penthouse in Buckhead, paying cash. Ironically, it was in the same neighborhood, perhaps 3 miles from the house Daniel and Rebecca had purchased years earlier. My penthouse had panoramic city views, luxurious finishes, and 2,000 square feet of pure refinement. I decorated it with imported furniture and artwork by emerging artists, all chosen by a famous designer. But I didn't flaunt it. I didn't post it on social media. I didn't tell anyone except Howard and a few close business associates. It was my secret, my private treasure. Through my connections in the business world, I kept Daniel up to date without his knowledge. I discovered he still worked at the same company, had been promoted to senior manager, and was now earning $220,000 a year. Rebecca had stopped working after Emma's birth and was now dedicating herself full-time to charitable causes and the elaborate social life she maintained. But I also discovered the truth behind the facade. They were up to their necks in debt. The mortgage on their $3 million home had a monthly payment of $14,000. The 2 luxury cars they drove were leased. The exotic trips they posted were paid for with credit cards. Rebecca spent recklessly on clothes, jewelry, and home decor. Patricia had cut off financial support after they refused to move to a smaller house when she suggested it. They lived on the edge of a financial precipice, maintaining appearances they couldn't sustain. I could have felt sorry. I could have silently offered help. But I remembered every humiliation, every cruel word, every time I'd been treated like I was worthless. I decided to wait patiently for the right moment to show Daniel exactly how wrong he was about me. That moment came when Howard suggested, during a private celebration for another successful business, that I give myself an extravagant gift. Something that symbolized everything I'd accomplished, he said. Something that would show the world, and especially myself, how far I'd come from where I started. I thought for weeks about what that gift would be. Jewelry? Property in an exotic location? A trip around the world? Nothing seemed right. Until I saw the ad. A completely customized Rolls-Royce Phantom, a one-of-a-kind edition, made to order with specifications that defied imagination. Exterior in an exclusive shade of petrol blue, interior in rare ostrich leather, trim in real white gold, and an entertainment system that alone cost $200,000. The total price was $32 million. $32 million for one car. It was absurd, it was ostentatious, it was completely unnecessary and impractical. And that was exactly why I wanted it. That car would be my personal monument to success, my physical proof that I had achieved something extraordinary, something no one would ever expect from the poor nurse from Atlanta. The delivery was scheduled for a sunny Tuesday in May. Howard was present, as were some of my closest associates. When the specialized truck arrived at my building's private garage and they began the delicate process of unloading that stunning car, I cried. Tears of pure accomplishment, of pride, of profound satisfaction. Here was tangible proof of everything I had achieved through years of brutal work, unwavering determination, and an absolute refusal to accept the fate others had tried to impose on me. It was Howard who, after a few glasses of Dom Perignon champagne at $1,200 a bottle, half-jokingly suggested I take a stroll around the neighborhood, show off that beauty. And then he got serious, looked me in the eye, and said, "Or maybe stop by your son's house." He knew the whole story. I'd told him on a vulnerable night months earlier. He knew the deep pain that broken relationship caused, even if I feigned indifference most of the time. I thought about the suggestion for a whole week. Would it be petty? Would it be cruel? Would it be stooping to his level? But then I sat alone in the quiet penthouse and remembered every moment of humiliation. The cold coins in my hand. The unambitious words. The look of shame on his face when I told him I didn't have $50,000 to give. Spending Christmas alone while he celebrated without inviting me. Finding out about Rebecca's pregnancy through a request for money. Being treated as an inconvenience, an embarrassment, as less than nothing. I decided this wasn't petty revenge. It was simply justice. I wasn't going to rub it in, I wasn't going to make a long speech, I wasn't going to confront him. I was simply going to show up, let him see for himself the woman I had become, and leave. Nothing more, nothing less. I chose a Saturday in June, one of those incredibly beautiful days with cloudless blue skies and perfect temperatures. I knew from my contacts that Daniel was usually home on Saturday mornings, washing the rented Mercedes in the garage, maintaining the immaculate appearance that was so important to him and Rebecca. I donned a discreet but clearly expensive Chanel ensemble, the Dior sunglasses I'd bought weeks earlier, and tied my hair in an elegant bun. I looked in the mirror and saw no longer the tired, neglected nurse, but a powerful, successful woman in complete control of her life. I drove the Rolls-Royce for the first time through the streets of Atlanta that morning. The feeling was surreal, as if I were floating on a cloud of pure accomplishment. The car drew everyone's attention. People stopped to stare, some took photos, others filmed with their cell phones, drivers slowed down just to get a better look. I felt like I was in a dream, as if it couldn't possibly be real. But it was real. Every luxurious inch of that car was real, paid for with money I had earned through hard work, smart decisions, and fierce determination. As I turned onto the street where Daniel lived, my heart began to beat faster, harder. Part of me wanted to turn around, avoid the confrontation, maintain my dignity silently. But I had come too far, worked too hard, and sacrificed too much to back down now. I parked the Rolls-Royce right in front of his house, the engine purring so softly it was almost inaudible. I turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, gathering my courage. Daniel was exactly where I expected, in the open garage, washing the black Mercedes with a hose and sponge. He was wearing designer shorts and an expensive polo shirt, sunglasses perched on top of his head. He glanced casually in the direction of my car as I parked, probably thinking it was a new neighbor or visitor. I slowly opened the driver's door, put my feet on the floor, and deliberately removed my sunglasses. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I saw the exact moment he recognized me. His eyes widened comically, the sponge fell from his hand to the floor with a wet splat, and the coffee cup balanced precariously on the hood of the Mercedes toppled over, spilling dark liquid across the paintwork he'd just washed. He froze, frozen in place, his eyes darting back and forth between my face and the car. his mind clearly unable to process what he was seeing. It was as if he'd seen a ghost or an impossible apparition. Rebecca appeared at the door at that moment, probably coming to see why Daniel had suddenly gone so quiet. She was wearing expensive gym clothes, her hair in a perfect ponytail, her makeup impeccable even at 9 in the morning. When she saw me in the car, her expression went from confusion to utter shock to something that looked like anger. She said something to Daniel that I couldn't hear, but he didn't respond, still frozen in place. Emma appeared beside Rebecca, a beautiful curly-haired girl I barely knew, my 4-year-old granddaughter whom I'd seen maybe 5 times in my life. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at Daniel, letting him see what I had become. Letting him process the impossibility of what he was witnessing. I saw shame appear on his face, mixed with disbelief, envy, confusion, maybe even a hint of anger. He tried to say something, his mouth moving like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. For the first time since he was a crying baby with colic, my son was truly speechless, without ready-made answers, without rehearsed excuses. I stood there beside the car for maybe 40 seconds, though each second felt like an hour. Then, very calmly, in the most controlled voice I could muster, I said just one sentence. You were right about one thing, Daniel. I truly never knew luxury for most of my life. But I finally did. The difference between us is that I built mine with dignity, honest work, and no shame about where I came from. I put my sunglasses back on, got in the car, and started the engine. As I slowly drove away down the street, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Daniel still standing in the exact same spot, covered in coffee stains, his mouth open, watching the car disappear. Rebecca had rushed into the house, probably to process what she'd just seen. Emma waved innocently, thinking she was just seeing a pretty car, completely oblivious to the emotional depth of the moment. I drove aimlessly for hours that day, just processing everything. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Deep satisfaction at having proven my point, at having shown him that he was completely wrong about who I was and what I was capable of. But also sadness because that victory had come at the cost of a relationship that had been dead for years. I felt no joy in his humiliation. I felt no pleasure in having caused that shock. I felt only a profound sense of completion, of a cycle that was finally closing after so many years of pain. 3 days later, Tuesday afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize but instinctively knew who it was. Daniel. His voice was different, lower, without that characteristic arrogance he'd developed over the years. He simply said, "We need to talk. Please." I agreed to meet him at a neutral cafe downtown, a public place where neither of us would have a territorial advantage. I purposely arrived 15 minutes early, chose a table in the back, and ordered a coffee I didn't even want, just to have something to hold on to. When Daniel walked in and saw me, he seemed to hesitate for a second before walking over to the table. He looked tired in a way that went beyond just lack of sleep. He seemed defeated, somehow smaller, even though he was 6 feet tall. He sat across from me in complete silence for at least 2 minutes, just fidgeting with his napkin, avoiding my gaze. Finally, he began to speak, his words coming out slowly, carefully chosen. He said he'd spent the last 3 days thinking constantly, that he'd done extensive research on me and my businesses, that he'd been absolutely shocked to discover how successful I'd become. He said he'd talked to Howard, that he'd learned about the investments, the company, the wealth I'd built. And then, for the first time in years, I saw tears in my son's eyes. He said he didn't understand how I'd done it, when it had happened, why I'd never told him anything. I asked calmly, my voice emotionless. And would you have cared if I had? You who didn't call me, who didn't visit me, who treated me like I was an embarrassment. He didn't know how to answer. What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in over a decade. Daniel admitted he'd been cruel, that he'd let Rebecca and Patricia dictate how he treated me, that he'd been ashamed of my simple life because it didn't fit the image he wanted to project. He said he'd chased an illusion of success, based on appearances and debt, while I'd built real, solid success. His words sounded sincere, his tears felt real, but I'd grown wary over the years. I'd learned that pretty words are cheap, easy. Actions are what matter in the end. I asked him directly about his finances. He hesitated, looked around the cafe as if checking if anyone he knew was within earshot, and then admitted everything. He said they were in serious trouble. Their debts had accumulated to nearly $400,000 between credit cards and personal loans. Rebecca was spending recklessly and refused any suggestion of lifestyle changes. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage payments, and the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings. Rebecca's parents had completely cut off financial support after a nasty fight over spending. Daniel had come, deep down, hoping I could help him financially. Help the son who had humiliated me, who told me I would never amount to anything, who hadn't invited me to Christmas, who had treated me like trash. I stared at him silently for a long moment, sipping the cold coffee, gathering my thoughts. Then I said something I'd been mentally rehearsing for days, anticipating this moment. I said I wouldn't pay his debts, I wouldn't solve his financial problems with a check, I wouldn't be the family bank that spurned me. But I offered something different. I offered him a real job at one of my companies. Not a bloated executive position, not an absurd salary, but honest work, starting as a real estate investment analyst with a starting salary of $55,000. I offered him the opportunity to learn about real business, about building real wealth instead of pretending to have it, about hard work and merit. I told him that if he proved dedication and competence, he could advance within the company. But he would have to earn every promotion, every raise. There would be no favoritism just because he was my son. Daniel was visibly surprised. He clearly expected me to either write him a huge check to bail him out or to angrily reject him outright. What I offered was somewhere in between. It was an outstretched hand, but with clear conditions. He would have to work hard, he would have to learn humility for the first time in his life. He would have to prove not only to me but to himself that he had value beyond appearances. He asked for time to think it over. A week later he called me and said he accepted, but there were conditions on his side as well. He said Rebecca wasn't happy about the situation at all, but that he had finally made a difficult decision. They were going to sell the house, pay off as much debt as they could, and move into a much more modest apartment. Rebecca was furious, he said, but for the first time in years, he had put his foot down and made a decision based on reality, not appearances. Her parents were horrified by his drop in social status. But Daniel seemed finally ready to live a real life instead of an expensive illusion. The following months were a strange period of cautious rebuilding. Daniel started working at my firm, arriving at 8 in the morning, leaving at 6 in the evening, learning every aspect of the real estate investment business from scratch. He had to analyze properties, perform return calculations, research markets, prepare reports. Real work that required genuine mental effort. His $55,000 salary was literally a quarter of what he'd earned before, but it was honest and sustainable. He and Rebecca sold their $3 million house at a loss during a bear market, making only $2.3 million. After paying off the remaining mortgage and penalties, they had $170,000 left. They used all this money to pay off credit card debt and loans. They still owed over $100,000, but at least they weren't drowning anymore. Rebecca couldn't handle the lifestyle change. 2 months after moving into a 2-bedroom apartment they rented for $1,800 a month, she took Emma and moved back in with her parents in Buckhead. She filed for divorce, demanding substantial alimony and full custody with minimal visitation for Daniel. It was an incredibly difficult time for my son. I watched him break down, processing the failure of his marriage, the loss of regular access to his daughter, the complete destruction of the life he had built. But I also saw something I hadn't seen in years: true humility, genuine reflection, personal growth. He began visiting me occasionally at the penthouse. At first, it was uncomfortable, with tense conversations about work and nothing else. But gradually, we began to talk about deeper things. About the mistakes he'd made, about how he'd let himself be defined by appearances rather than substance, about how he'd mistreated the one person who'd always been there for him. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but something slowly began to rebuild between us. Today, 3 years after that memorable Saturday, our relationship is still complicated but better. Daniel still works at my company, now as an acquisitions manager earning $85,000 a year, every penny earned through proven merit. He lives in a comfortable but modest apartment, pays all his bills on time, and saves money for the first time in his life. He has joint custody of Emma after a long legal battle, and I finally have a real relationship with my granddaughter, seeing her regularly, being the grandmother I always wanted to be. Rebecca remarried a wealthy businessman and continues to live her ostentatious life. Daniel says she's happy the way she is, and he's happy to no longer be part of that fake world. I can't say my relationship with Daniel is back to what it was when he was a child. Much pain has been experienced, many words have been said, many actions cannot be undone. But there is respect now, there is honesty, there is a real foundation on which we are building something new and perhaps stronger than what we had before. He recently told me that the best thing I did for him was not simply solving his problems with money, that forcing him to grow, to work, to earn his own way was the most valuable gift I could give. As for me, I continue building my empire. My net worth now exceeds $80 million. I have investments in several states, participate in development projects in 3 countries, and serve on corporate boards. But I've learned that money, as important as it is for security and freedom, isn't what truly defines success. Success is dignity, it's self-respect, it's knowing you've built something with your own hands that no one can take away from you. The Rolls-Royce? I still have it, of course. I drive it occasionally on special occasions, but it's no longer a symbol of revenge. It's simply a reminder that it's never too late to completely change your life, to refuse the destiny others have determined, to become the person you always had the potential to be. If you identified with my story, if you've ever felt undervalued, despised, or underestimated by people who should support you, leave a like to help me reach more people. In the comments, tell me your story. Have you ever been through something similar? How did you deal with the pain of being rejected by the one you love? Subscribe to the channel for more real and moving stories like this. And always remember, never ever let someone's cruel words define who you are, what you're worth, or what you can achieve. You have more power within you than you realize. Sometimes all it takes is a spark, a moment of anger transformed into determination, to ignite a fire that changes your entire life. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me until the end.